as the novel coronavirus pandemic continues to encircle the globe and inundating already weakened public healthcare systems in the process. The island of Cuba, challenged by decades-old American sanctions, has sent more than 2,000 doctors and nurses to 23 countries since the crisis reached fever pitch. The emergency response teams are joining the 28,000 Cuban health professionals who were working in 59 countries prior to this outbreak. While the international community has lauded Cuba's efforts at rendering much-needed aid to coronavirus-stricken hotspots, 3 Republican senators in the United States Senate are not too pleased with these efforts. They introduced the Cut Profits to Regime Act on June 17, 2020. The act proposes that the State Department publish the list of countries that do business with Havana, specific to their medical missions program. The proposed legislation will punish host countries, many of whom are neighboring Caribbean islands, by blacklisting them as engaging in the illegal human trafficking of Cuban medical professionals. American Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is already demanding accountability from the Pan American Health Organization on this issue.
PAHO must explain why it did not seek the approval of the Executive Council, its own Executive Council, for its role in this program. And PAHO must explain who in the organization approved a potentially illegal agreement.
This morning, I'm joined by a team of foreign policy and geopolitical experts to discuss American pressure tactics in the Western Hemisphere and in other parts of the global South. Here to discuss these issues are Grenada's Foreign Minister, Peter David, Dr. Andre Horton, economist and senator in the Jamaica Parliament, Kimberly Phillip of the Caribbean Solidarity Network, and attorney Yama Gerard, who is based in Ottawa, Canada. Also joining our panel for the Spotlight interview is Ryan Nelson Pariag, who is the president of the Grenada-Houston Association, to discuss how Grenadians in Texas are coping with the coronavirus crisis that is enveloping Houston and other metropolitan areas in the Sunbelt. It's Sunday, June 28th, 2020, and this is the Bub Report, Sunday edition. Good morning and welcome to another Sunday edition of the Kellen Bub Report. Before I bring on my first guest this morning, there are 2 major stories that have been developing over the last 72 hours in the Caribbean that we want to bring your attention to. Antigua's Prime Minister Gaston Brown announced, quote, "From all indication, regional carrier Liat will be liquidated," adding, quote, that COVID would have actually, let's say, increased the losses for the airline. So whereas in all of 2019, Liat made a loss of about 12 million EC dollars, that was within the means of the shareholder governments to subsidize. Brown goes on to say on local radio in Antigua, quote, "You would have found that since COVID, the planes have been grounded. They have to pay the lease payments and they are not getting any revenue," unquote. Certainly the liquidation of Liat would be the end of an era for Caribbean aviation. In fact, Liat was founded by the late Kititian Frank DeLille in Montserrat on 20th of October, 1956, and they began flying with a single Piper Apache operating between Antigua and Montserrat. Over in Grenada, protests erupted in the community of Fort Judy overnight over the alleged mob-like assault of a Grenadian Guyanese contractor in the person of Evan Smith at the hands of a Caucasian family. Social activists who mobilized the protesters are calling for law enforcement to swiftly charge the perpetrators for the crime with the same standard that is applied to local Grenadians. Certainly, we are following this story, and next week we would actually be having a discussion around policing on the show. But at this point, I want to welcome my first guest to the stream. I have Mr. Ryan Nelson Pariag, who is the president of the Grenada-Houston Association. Mr. Pariag, good morning and welcome to you.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Now, Mr. Pariag, when did you assume the presidency of the association?
This is my second term, so I am. It is a 3-year term, so I just got reelected last September. So it's good that I'm on my 4th year.
Okay, on your 4th year. Would you say that the Grenadian community in Houston is growing?
It is. We have a migration of Grenadians coming into the Houston area from New Jersey, New York area. So we've seen that number grown over the years. So when I first moved here 26 years ago, I
Mm-hmm.
did not meet a Grenadian until probably well into my 5th year here. So right now, almost everywhere I go, somebody tells me that I know a Grenadian. Or do you know somebody? So that's tell you how it have changed over the last half century.
Right. So would you
Quarter
surmise
century.
that there is a migration from the north, from the northeast, to that Sunbelt region in the United States of Grenadians?
Yeah, and I think, and in addition to that, we have the university, which is in Midwestern University.
Midwestern state?
Grenadians going there, and most of the people that go, they have relationship with or family in Houston. So there is that connection with that as well, to the
Okay.
addition to the natural migration.
Now let's get on to COVID. The COVID coronavirus crisis hit the Grenadian community particularly hard in the Brooklyn, New York area. Now, how are you as an association preparing for that eventuality in your neck of the woods? And how are you mobilizing, I suppose, Grenadians to ensure that they are prepared?
Well, one of the things we have done is partner with the Harris County Public Health Department. And so they give us the information. And from that, we send out that information to our members, let them know, for example, I'm about to send out a newsletter that would give information as to testing sites and other areas that we could do. What we have done so far, we have collaborated with the Grenadians in Action COVID Fund, which specifically set up to help the people affected with COVID in New York. But we expanded it out to help other people all throughout the U.S. And I'm the chairperson of that as well too. So we are working with partners in different ways to get it. And I was sending up this morning to my board asking them if they know of any Grenadians have affected by the COVID. So we're in the exploratory phase right now, trying to find out who is affected, and then from that we'll know how to help and what areas that needed help.
And what kind of communication are you having with your official point of contact, meaning whether it's the consulate office that's nearest to you or the embassy? Who are your closest point of
So
contact?
for the embassy standpoint, I am in regular contact with Ambassador Yulan Smith, and she's also on the COVID response team. So we in regular communication with her on that, and so we have started that communication about a year ago, which really lends itself to having that framework in place to be able to jump in with the COVID. Now she was our guest speaker at our last gala, which happened in February of this year, and from that we were able to establish and continue that relationship. So having those relationship established really with COVID now, we're able to really get into action and do stuff quickly because the we don't have the relationship is already established.
Okay, now what about, are you do you have any indication of Grenadians in the Texas area? Obviously, there are a lot of students there as well at Midwestern who have expressed an interest in wanting to return to Grenada.
Yes, we were trying to get. We were working with the embassy in terms of people that get stuck here to go back home, and we had the first plane landed in Grenada last Wednesday, I think it was, and
Mhm.
so we haven't gotten much information on that, and so a lot of Grenadians are very prideful in some of that. They don't want people to know their business, so to speak. So we're having some problems getting information as quickly as we can. So all we're trying to do is to send out information as we get them to the communication, whether through email, through our website, and word of mouth, obviously.
Okay. Mr. Pariag, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I look forward to having future conversations with you as this story develops. You have a wonderful Sunday.
Thank you for having me. Have a great day.
Absolutely.
Okay.
All right, folks, we will take a break. We will now have some headlines from Grenada.
Medical staff sent around the world come from the Henry Reeve Emergency Medical Contingent. It was started in 2005 by the late Fidel Castro and specializes in rapid response to natural disasters and outbreaks. Since then, the unit has helped 3.5 million people in 21 countries. But Cuba's medical internationalism goes back further than 2005 and is rooted in the struggle against colonialism. It all goes back to the Cuban Revolution in 1959, when Castro overthrew Fulgencio Batista's dictatorship and established a communist regime. Free healthcare and education were identified as universal human rights, so the country invested in its own healthcare system. But it also built an international outreach effort in order to respond to situations like natural disasters, as well as help other countries with their anti-colonial struggles. During the Algerian War of Independence, Cuba sent their doctors to help after French doctors left the country. Some of those wounded in the war were even brought back to Cuba for medical treatment. Such medical missions were essentially free, but they served to encourage diplomacy and helped Cuba overcome political isolation due to the US embargo. Since Cuba sent their doctors to Algeria in the 60s, the countries have remained friends and allies. Today, Cuba has one of the highest number of doctors per capita in the world at 8.2 doctors per 1,000 people. That's 3 times higher than the US. But how does the country even have that many doctors? In 1959, when Castro assumed power, half of the 6,300 doctors in the country defected. So the country concentrated its efforts on training new doctors. They put in place an emergency accelerated curriculum in 1963 so that they could realize their vision for a free and accessible public health system. They also invited students from newly independent African and Caribbean countries to enroll. Academic records were not the only criteria. So was a commitment to solidarity and serving communities without access to health. The program has changed a lot over the years, but there's one thing that sets Cuban medical graduates apart: their community focus.
And welcome back. Now let me welcome my panelists for this morning. I have Ms. Kimberly Phillip, Canadian, I suppose. You're based in Ottawa, I believe. You're Grenadian. Yeah. And the Honorable Peter David, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Grenada. He's also the Member of Parliament, the current incumbent in the town of St. George, probably one of the longest serving MPs in that constituency, Peter. And then we also have Ms. Yafa Jafar, who is a human attorney that is also based in Ottawa. Yafa, you're based in Ottawa, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And this morning, we really want to get into a discussion around American geopolitical involvement in the Caribbean space in this era. Now, MP David, I would begin with you. The United States senators are alleging that your country and other Caribbean countries are participating in an elaborate human trafficking scheme of Cuban doctors and nurses. Is there any truth to that proposition, Mr. David? If not, why not?
Well, first of all, let me thank you, Kellen, for having me, and let me say how grateful I am to be on a list of on a panel with such distinguished panelists. And the notion that the Caribbean, and in particular Grenada and the OECS countries, but the entire Caribbean is involved in human trafficking is absolutely ridiculous. You know, I'm not sure if you've seen the statement put out by Prime Minister Gaston Bluff on behalf of the OECS countries, which are the countries of the smaller countries of the Eastern Caribbean, absolutely rejecting it. one of the unfortunate things is that the list of countries involved in human trafficking is an important list, and one that should not be politicized. And it is a view of the CARICOM and OECS countries, and I dare say the wider CARICOM community, that it is a politicization of the list that bothers us, and apart from the other issues. And the attempt by the senators, I don't want to expand it to the entire US government at this time, but these senators to try to use the human trafficking list, a very serious and important instrument for their own narrow political interests. And that's all it is, the narrow political interest.
Peter, I don't mean to cut you. You said you don't want to extend it to the entire US government, but clearly the United States government has been attempting to interfere in how the Caribbean pass its alliances recently.
Yes, I was referring when I said that, I'm referring to the idea of using the list. It is still at that level. This is human trafficking list, no doubt. There's been a lot of attempts throughout history to try to stifle the Cuban government. I think this is an attack on the Cuban government going back to the early 1960s with the imposition of the sanctions. I was thinking last night as I contemplated this program, and the U.S. attempts at Cuba reminds me of the knee on the neck of our dear brother George, who was killed by the police officers in the U.S. They are absolutely trying to kill the Cuban progressive government. And I agree with you, that extends beyond Rubio and the others, but that is what I was exactly referring to.
Now, are the rights of Cuban doctors and other health professionals being violated in host countries? There is the allegation that medical professionals are not guaranteed freedom of movement, for example, and that they are that they have minders. There are minders in these host countries who are supervising these doctors every move.
Absolute nonsense, Kevin. I mean, I have interacted with Cuban doctors for the last 20, 30 years in Grenada. Many of them, in fact, come to Grenada. Some have developed families in Grenada. They go back and forth between Grenada and Cuba. They visit their family in Cuba. I have traveled to Cuba on the plane many times, and on the plane are Cuban doctors who are going back home to come back. So no, Cuban doctors in Grenada enjoy all the rights and privileges of Grenadian citizens. So the notion that Cuban doctors are minded in Grenada by Cuban, you see, the issue is this, and Gaston said it clearly in his were it a motion or a piece of legislation to try to help us in COVID. You see, this is the COVID period. And the COVID period is one where we call on governments like the United States government, like Marco Rubio, to come to our assistance. Were it not for Cuban assistance, not only to Grenada, in fact, not only to CARICOM, you see, as far as Italy, 35,000 Cuban medical practitioners are around the world helping persons, and this is what they are trying to do without offering any alternative. I tell you, Kellen, you go to any doctor in any hospital in Grenada, you go to any hospital in the Caribbean, you will see doctors who are trained in Cuba. Not only Cuban doctors who are there to help, but Grenadian doctors, Jamaican doctors, St. Lucian doctors, Vincentian doctors, across all political spectrum, across all social spectrum in the Caribbean, helping to develop our healthcare system. So the idea of trying to suggest that Cuban doctors coming to Grenada and are suffering in some way or another is absolute nonsense. And again, an attempt to politicize what is...
Mr. David, let me press you on something. I'm trying to understand the nature of the contractual arrangement, if there is any contractual arrangement between your country and other Caribbean countries and the government of Cuba, read the supply of medical professionals.
It is a bilateral arrangement, as every other bilateral arrangement between countries. The Cuban, let me give you an example. During the COVID crisis, we determined that we needed 4 doctors, one in intensive care, one in several areas, the Minister of Health. I contacted, as the Minister for Foreign Affairs, I contacted our ambassador in Grenada, who contacted the Ministry of Health in Havana. And in a couple of weeks, we got the 4 specialists that we needed. We are, in some cases, when the Cubans come to Grenada, we are responsible for their upkeep. We are responsible sometimes for paying some fees to them. But there is nothing to suggest any kind of human trafficking arrangement with the Cuban government. We, for example, provide housing, we provide meals, we provide all of their services, while in Grenada, the Cuban government, their salaries are continued and enjoying the same benefits that all doctors enjoy in Grenada.
So the government of Grenada does not pay the salaries of Cuban doctors.
There are cases where you can have that specific arrangement with the Cuban government if you wish.
My question is that arrangement in place? Generally, no. Okay. No. In the case of Grenada, no. We don't know what other bilateral arrangements are held for other countries. Now, Mr. David, now you would appreciate that this appears to be punishment by proxy, wouldn't you say? That the United States wants to punish those alliances.
It's a Helms-Burton Act being played out through this use of the trafficking, what do you call it, the human trafficking list. It's the Helms-Burton Act where you try to stifle third parties. In other words, because we do not intervene in American relationship with their countries. We do not intervene in America's relationship with Saudi Arabia or any other countries that they choose to have relations with, despite what takes place within Saudi Arabia. But this is an interference in our internal relationships with countries like Cuba. We want good relations with the United States. In fact, we have good relationship with the United States. I have had conversations very often with US diplomats. So at the end, go ahead.
They still have a big stick.
Well, you know, Maurice always said, when the US sneezes, we catch the cold. We live in the footprints of the US, and therefore we have to be cognizant of that. But we want the region to be a zone of peace. We have called for this over and over. We have made every attempt to have good relations, and we, in fact, have good relations with the United States government. I have excellent relationships with the diplomats in the region. So we see this as an attempt to try to get at Cuba. We have called for the lifting of sanctions against Cuba. We have called for the Cuban government to be allowed to develop in their own system as they please. And this is just another attempt by Uribe and so on to use the Caribbean in their political battles.
All right, and now I'm going to bring on Kimberly Phillip and Yafa Jafar to continue the discussion. Now, Kimberly, how would you react to this latest attempt to punish Caribbean countries?
Are you hearing me clearly? I have my fan on. Okay.
Yes.
You know, Kalan, you used the word mob yesterday when you posted about the unjust beating of Evan Smith in Grenada. And I think that's the word that keeps coming up for me when I think about the US, the ways in which they continue to bully countries, getting them to vote in particular ways in international spaces. The Human Rights Council recently discussed a resolution to look at anti-Black racism in the U.S. And the U.S. and other countries really bullied African countries and other nations from voting in support of this resolution. And I think that kind of mob approach is the approach that the U.S. has been taking for decades. And we see that in the number of invasions and the number of attempted invasions and attempted coup in the region. We look at the 1994 invasion of Haiti and the ousting of democratically elected leader Jean-Bertrand Aristide. We see the 1989 invasion of Panama, the 1983 invasion of Grenada. And what came after the invasion was the active restructuring of our policies and legislation to really minimize dissent and ensure that our political structure really reflected U.S. Interests. We see the 1965 invasion of the Dominican Republic and multiple attempts to invade Cuba and to really shatter the Cuban economy. And so, to me, it's not a surprise to see these senators, these Republican senators, put forward a bill that is intellectually void. When you look at the language in this bill, when they talk about human trafficking, and you look at the definition of human trafficking, the United Nations Office for the High Commissioner of Human Rights, like they name human trafficking in ways that this bill clearly does not meet. It's couched in this benevolent attempt to look out for people who are being taken advantage of by the COVID crisis, which is absurd. If we really want to talk about who is benefiting from the COVID crisis, it's not these doctors that are providing free healthcare in countries where they cannot afford it, and who volunteer their time. It's not those doctors. The people who are benefiting from this COVID crisis include people like Jeff Bezos, who is the founder of Amazon. Amazon saw its profits increase by 30% in the first 3 months of the lockdown. Their global sales surged to US $11,000 a second. $11,000 a second since the lockdown, which is now leaving the world's richest man. Jeff Bezos is the world's richest man, set to become a trillionaire in 6 years. So I think when we talk about who is really benefiting from the crisis, it's not Cuba, who has been victim to this illegal US blockade since the 1960s. It's people like Jeff Bezos. And Jeff Bezos as a man, right? An individual human being is worth 161.1 billion US dollars. The GDP of Cuba, that has 11 million people plus, is 100 billion as of 2018. So one man is worth more than 11 million people. I think we really need to not be fooled by the attempts of Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, and Rick Scott trying to say that they care for people. If they really cared for people, they would make sure that African Americans and all Americans have access to public health care, which is what Cuba keeps showing us, that it is possible to have public health care systems.
But Mr. David, would you say that the United States government under this current administration has been successful in dividing the Caribbean? I mean, you look at instances where Trump invited certain leaders to several White House meetings, right? And so CARICOM had to put out statements disavowing these actions. And would you say that the region is demonstrating leadership right now? Doesn't seem so on this issue. Mr. David?
Sorry, I wasn't hearing you clearly. What was the question?
Yes, my question is, the region doesn't seem to be having a united front in confronting the United States with respect to the hegemony in the region.
On the issue of course, we have different political parties and in office, and we have different political and ideological positions. But I think in general, with respect to Cuba, I think the call for the lifting of the sanctions, the call for the region being a zone of peace, and on those issues, we have unity in the Caribbean. On specific issues in relation to Venezuela, which is what you might be referring to in terms of how we approach Venezuela. Of course, there are some governments that are members of the Lima group, which would take a slightly different position on some issues. But even on the issue of Venezuela, all of the countries of CARICOM agree that the region should be a zone of peace and that the issues with respect to Venezuela should be resolved peacefully. So there may be some variance in how far we go, but I think on the issue of Cuba, we have unity, and on the issue of Venezuela, while there are differences, I think all CARICOM countries oppose intervention in the region by any country from outside, including the United States.
What would be the strategy if the United States government says that it is actually going to punish Caribbean countries for hosting Cuban doctors? How do you respond to that outside of just rhetoric and statements? Because those are good.
Kellen, we are limited in what we can do. You see what happens with the EU in relation to blacklisting of Grenada and other countries. We are small island developing states, and what we have is a clout of coming together. We can't struggle like this. We have to struggle like this. So we come together. If it comes to a head, you've already seen that the OECS countries, the smallest of the countries, have issued a statement absolutely rejecting the notion and calling on the US government to reject it, and the Congress and the Senate to reject it. We, of course, will do what lobbying we can. We will deal with our bilateral relationships on this issue. The issue is nonsense. I mean, Cuban doctors coming to Grenada are paid by the Grenadian government. We have a bilateral relationship with the government. They're paid by the government. There is no issue of human trafficking. They have all the rights, all the privileges. In fact, what Marco Rubio and his friends should be doing is presenting some kind of package to the Senate and the Congress as to how they can help Caribbean countries. And that is why US policy is so misguided. You know, every week I have somebody calling me and asking me to seek medical attention for the family. And who do they ask me to call? They ask me to call either the Cubans or in some cases the Chinese. So the US should understand that we in the region, we want medical care, and the Cubans have provided it, and we have done nothing to compromise Cuban citizens. So what will we do? We will lobby. We will come together. We will issue statements. We will use, and I do believe within the Congress And within the Senate, there's an increasing amount of progressive politicians. Hopefully, Kellen, I've seen you speaking on many forums in the US. Hopefully,
Oh, you are paying attention, huh? You are paying attention.
I am paying attention to you, my brother. I really welcome the strides you're making and what you're doing to advocate for us. So when we have people like yourself and Kimberly in Canada advocating for the Caribbean, this is what we need. We need our diaspora to become active, use their political clout in their communities, vote for senators, vote for congressmen who will not attack the Caribbean, but support the Caribbean. That is the role you can play in helping us in the region. We will do whatever work we can on this side.
All right, and let me welcome Yafa Jafar. And so we want to broaden the scope of this discussion, but also make it relevant to the Caribbean, because historically, post-colonial Caribbean societies would have had significant alliances with the Palestinian people. And Yafa, you can speak. You actually have some personal experience with respect to American involvement in the Israeli-Palestine conflict. So, can you share with us your perspective as someone who comes from the West Bank? I believe it's from the West Bank, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely. Thank you, Kelon, and thank you for having me on this show today. I'm truly honored to be part of this discussion. So if the question is whether I see some familiarity to what's happening to Cuba right now in terms of response, the answer is absolutely, as a Palestinian. And I am born and raised in Palestine, born in Jerusalem, raised in the city of Ramallah, and now living in Canada. So since the late 1990s, most Latin American and Caribbean nations have come to support the Palestinian struggle for statehood, for the right of return, opposing Israel and its allies, and their severe repression of the Palestinians. And the reason that the connection and solidarity between Cuba and Palestine is historic and strong is that we simply get it. We get each other's struggle because we also experience similar punishment. So we know that in July of 2019, the United Nations Human Rights Council adopted a resolution condemning the imposition of unilateral coercive measure of sanctions by the United States and all of its allies against Cuba and Venezuela and Iran. And the resolution was proposed by Palestine and Venezuela and approved by 28 votes in favor, 14 abstaining, and again, it was presented by Venezuela and Palestine on behalf of Cuba and Iran as well. So the American imperial influence in Palestine, and in particular, the unwavering support to Israel and their apartheid policies against the Palestinians is not new. It's not historic. And now we see in Cuba's immediate response to the global pandemic is really a reflection of Cuba's deep, long-standing commitment to humanitarian solidarity with other countries. Cuba has done this before. This is not the first time, obviously, as we have been speaking. They were on the front line of the fight against the Ebola in Africa. The American response to Cuba's unmatched and unprecedented record of contribution to global health crisis is what I call as imperial fragility. The United States is penalizing boats, shipping companies that ships food and petroleum to Cuba, and this has already weakened the Cuban economy. And I think it's really important for us to understand that there is either a lack of understanding on the nature and extent of the US embargo and decades-long sanctions on Cuba, or a willful refusal to understand it. And we have other examples, such as bottled water that goes into Cuba that's provided by Mexican companies. And the Mexican company that does provide it to Cuba was told, if you dock in Cuba, you cannot dock in the US. So now they are not exporting that bottled water anymore. So I think that there is a real sense that there is no more important time right now than actually for nations to stand in solidarity with Cuba, because we owe it to Cuba. We all owe it to Cuba to do that, because after all the years of sanctions and all of the punishment that they have endured, the first response that they do have to a global pandemic is to go and help.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, And this, I would segue into a discussion of the Israeli-Palestine conflict, but within the context of the Caribbean.
Yes.
So we have been seeing, and I would throw this out to the entire panel, we have been seeing overtures by Israel to influence Caribbean votes at the United Nations General Assembly with respect to things like situating Jerusalem as the capital of the Israeli state, and with respect to other pro-Israel propositions. Now, Mr. David, I would start with you. What does that look like in the context of Grenada? How is Israel attempting to have its footprint there?
Well, first of all, let me say how happy I am to be here with one of our Palestinian sisters who's involved in the struggle in Palestine. And certainly I want to agree with her that throughout the Caribbean, the Palestinian people have received the support of Caribbean people, and the treatment of Palestine has been a stain on the collective conscience of the world. Year after year, the United Nations gives support, and year after year, this support is ignored by several countries. Yes, I do believe that the Palestinian cause needs to be lifted up more. I think, and in reference to Cuba, just to segue for a minute back to Cuba before I deal with the issue, Cuba is also, for all Africans throughout the world, the Cuban role in South Africa is one that we must take note of. At Quito Carnival, where it was because of Cuban military assistance in defeating the apartheid forces that invaded Angola many years ago, that we were able to defeat apartheid. In addition to the fact, at the time, you remember there was constructive, I don't know if you're old enough to remember, Kellan, there was this talk of constructive engagement by the Reagan regime at the time with respect to South Africa that was murdering Black people. So the history of Cuban support, and similarly with Palestine. That is why when Nelson Mandela his freedom was attained, that he visited Cuba and visited with many of the Palestinian leaders. But certainly, there is much more needing to be done in the Caribbean with respect to Palestine. I myself have done what I've addressed many audiences on that. And I think even within the US government, there's support for Palestine. You remember the book, President Carter, Apartheid. I can't remember the exact title, but referring to the Israeli government as an apartheid regime. But yes, Israel has been trying to sanitize its treatment of Palestinians throughout the world. In fact, in a couple of days, there's a possible annexation of a whole lot of Palestinian land. And to me, there's not enough uproar about that. And hopefully it doesn't just quietly go by and become a fait accompli for the Palestinian people. So yes, there's a lot we need to do, Kellan. And I think we need to advocate more and see the synergies between the African Americans, the Africans, and the Palestinians. We are all engaged in the same struggle. And the struggle is not necessarily with the United States. The struggle is with not only an idea, but an attempt by some forces throughout the world to dominate places like Palestine, to dominate places like Africa, to dominate places like the Caribbean, so that we are not able to pursue the path that we want to pursue. That is all we ask for, self-determination, the ability to pursue the path that we as a people want to pursue, just as America does. The same freedoms that America fought for in their war, in their struggle for independence is what we are struggling for in the Caribbean.
All right, Yafa?
Yes, thank you, Mr. David, and I truly echo everything that you have said, and it's an honor for me to be on this discussion with you as well. And I just want to draw attention to the fact that there already exists the so-called Caribbean Israel Coalition, right? And the reason why I'm bringing that, and exactly, Mr. David, you referred to the term.
Yafa, I'm sorry to cut you, but I wanted to introduce Dr. Andre Horton from Jamaica. He has a very busy schedule, but he has agreed to come on to speak to that issue. So, Dr. Horton, welcome. I will get to you shortly, but Yafa, continue.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on the show.
Yes, we'll get to you shortly, Dr. Horton.
Yeah,
definitely. I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you. And the reason why I wanted to draw attention to the Caribbean Israeli Coalition, because it's just a very ripe example looking at the goals of that initiative, the whole project is nothing but greenwashing and whitewashing efforts.
Go on.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Made by Israel to further and strengthen U.S. imperialism in the region of the Caribbean. And that connection is really important for us to understand, but also to extract resources from the Caribbean. So we must remember that Israel has been working hard since the 2005 call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions to beautify its image in the world, especially after the massacres that it committed in Gaza, through promoting, exporting their security and policing systems, inventions, etc., technologies, irrigation systems. All can be true, but what is also true is that it cannot be ignored that any official normalization of relationships with Israel is an automatic support and contribution to furthering oppression and apartheid against the Palestinians. And just to conclude on this point, the cancellation, as an example, just to bring the cancellation of the African-Israel Summit in 2017 is just really an example that can be used by also Caribbean countries now to see how Israel is so desperately trying to enter the Caribbean through greenwashing and projects. And the cancellation of that summit resulted from significant opposition by South Africa and other African countries as well. And it has really put a brake on Israel's effort to improve the ties to Africa and meets its state goals, per se, of changing how African countries traditionally have supported the Palestinians and how the way that they traditionally have voted in the United Nations. So it's not really out of goodwill of we want to do these development projects in the Caribbean. It's really more dangerous than that.
Okay, Kimberly?
Yeah, no, I'm just really happy that Yafa was able to join us today because, and I saw someone, they made a comment to this as well, like the People's Revolutionary Government from 1979 to 83 supported the liberation of Palestinians and their rights to return and vocally denounced Zionism. And I think the denouncing of Zionism is really important because what we see happening currently in the US, Canada, and elsewhere is that if you call out the Israeli apartheid state, it gets inaccurately reduced to you being Zionist and you hating Jews. And that is not the case. And there are many Jewish people who support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, and who are also calling for the right of Palestinian people to return to their lands that were taken. And so I think it's really critical, and I'm really happy that we're making the connections between other liberation struggles, the liberation struggles of Palestine and Palestinians, and what is happening in the Caribbean region as well.
Dr. Horton, thank you for joining us. I know that you have a busy schedule, but Jamaica has actually been at the center of a lot of Israeli votes. As a matter of fact, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he is heavily courted, Prime Minister Holness. Now, what say you about Israeli involvement in the region?
I mean, you have to understand that the world has evolved, and when you look at globalization, there are a lot of countries who are allies with other countries. But what is fundamental for us to understand is the difference between a right-wing and a left-wing approach towards leadership. So if you look at the world now, where Jamaica is, and you look at how, for example, Donald Trump is operating in America, you look at how, for example, our leader is currently operating here, and you look at the UK, and for example, how their leader is operating. It's a particular frame of mind, it's a particular mindset that this is how the world is. There are some leaders who believe in equity, some leaders who believe in the equal distribution of resources among all its people, while there are other leaders who believe in supremacy of a particular color, a particular creed, a particular race. So the classism and the racism that exists around the world, and I sympathize with my Palestinian brothers and sisters to what has happened to them. But remember that where we are now, it has been a run-up to this particular time in our history. And we have faced struggles, and we continue to face struggles if we do not understand ourselves in many facets. So it's not just understanding that we are poor and underprivileged. It's understanding where has this been coming from. It's understanding of who we are as a people. It's an understanding of who we want to become. And from our point of view, the level of disunity that we've been seeing in the Caribbean since this current administration came into power, it is appalling. And the level of racism, the level of classism that we have been seeing around the world over the last year, the last 6 months, is now really showing us the reality of the world that we live in. And as I was having a conversation with someone yesterday, that in order for us to re-propel, or in order for us to re-engage, we need a leader, and we need global leaders who understand what it takes for the world to function in harmony. We were saying that Emperor Selassie might have been the last leader who understood that the world functions as an ecosystem, and the oppression that Black people face, the oppression that Palestinians face, the oppression that poor people face is the same oppression that the lions in the zoo, the tigers, the birds face. And it's the same oppression that, for example, the sea face when it's polluted. It's the same oppression that our atmosphere face when it is also polluted. So the point is, if we're looking for that Captain Planet, then it cannot be a bias just towards human oppression. It must be a holistic understanding of how life functions, a holistic understanding that whatever you put in is what you get out. And we want to see a world where human beings function in a way that they take care of the other animals around them, take care of the other species, and fundamentally take care of the environment. So the sustainable development that we're looking for, and the United Nations has this as a part of its goals, and Jamaica also has a Vision 2030. Many countries do. The sustainable development that we're looking for, it's not just human development or the movement of human comfort. It is the understanding that if we treat the other animals right, if we treat the other species right, if we treat the environment right, but all of this is going to take a maturity in mentality that I don't think the current global leadership possesses.
Well, let us get away from global leadership and segue into Caribbean leadership. Mr. David, Dr. Horton seems to be indicting lack of leadership. What say you?
Well, I think he's speaking of lack of leadership with respect to some issues, and I will acknowledge that there are issues that have not been treated as importantly as others. But I would disagree to say that there is no Caribbean leadership, because I think many of us.
Let him finish. Let him finish.
Yeah,
Andre.
so let him go ahead. Let me intervene. I don't mind. Go ahead, no.
Yes. What do you want to say, Dr.
I don't misrepresent what he said. I want to
make us point of view. I love the work that Mia has been doing, but she needs strength, because if you're looking, for example, to achieve the objective, then her alone and her voice. Eric Williams said 10 minus 1 is 0. That shows you the importance of the Jamaican leadership. So the analogy that I was making was just looking at the leadership that Jamaica has, the leadership that the United States has, and the leadership that England has. I wasn't talking about the Caribbean leadership, because Mia is a lady that I really admire, and she has been doing very, very well. But as you realize, she has not been getting the support from Jamaica.
Well, I wouldn't comment on Jamaica's leadership. Dr. Horton is Jamaican and is more.
Peter, you would not comment on Jamaican leadership, but the party in which you are affiliated with in Grenada, they are closely aligned with the political party, the ruling party, the JLP.
Exactly. That does not entitle me to make a comment on Jamaican leadership in the party-to-party relations. We have party-to-party relations. The Jamaican party has the same relations with many other parties. So what in fact, I think Dr. Horton made the point that Mia Motley, who is the chair of CARICOM now, has been speaking and been throughout Africa. There's an initiative now which we all support throughout CARICOM to closen our relationship between the Caribbean and Africa, something that we've been advocating for many, many years, and that is an initiative we absolutely support. So I think there have been some initiatives. Now, the Caribbean leadership in the world goes back many, many, many decades. You talk about the Eric Williams that Dr. Horton spoke about. You talk about Michael Manley. You talk about Errol Barrow. These were the giants on the world stage. And during the non-aligned movement, you're well aware, Dr. Horton, that the role Jamaica played in the non-aligned movement and Michael Manley's approaches. So the Caribbean has had a history of leadership. Now it ebbs and flows, and with the changing world circumstances, we have to adapt to that. And maybe the Caribbean has not yet adapted fully to that. But I would argue that the Caribbean has been providing leadership. Look at Venezuela. Were it not for Caribbean leadership on the issue of Venezuela, and I talk about collective Caribbean leadership, Venezuela may have ceased to be what it is today. So I think we have pressed. I myself have been on teams speaking to the United Nations, meeting, going throughout the Caribbean, going throughout the international community, and addressing the issues for the need for the Caribbean to maintain a zone of peace. Now we are facing extreme difficulties. Caribbean countries are small island developing states. We are facing the mighty European Union that continue to blacklist us and continue to bring pressure on us. The United States with the present government is bringing immense pressure on us. So we have to adapt on these issues. But I would say that we are fighting the struggle and the leadership has been provided. As my brother Horton said, Mia Motley has been an excellent leader of CARICOM, and I think she's advocated well on our behalf. And not only is she lifting the standard, the profile of Caribbean women, but she's also lifting the profile of the Caribbean in general.
But Mr. David, the Prime Minister of Grenada has been one of the longest-serving leaders of the region. Certainly.
And he has provided leadership. Even on the issue of Cuba, Prime Minister Mitchell was the first one in the Caribbean to have rapprochement with Fidel. In fact, Fidel was brought to Grenada. So there are issues that some may agree with and some may disagree with, certainly. But I think Prime Minister Mitchell has provided, on the issue of Cuba that we are addressing today, he has provided really strong leadership on that issue. And despite everything else, he has maintained the call for the sanctions to be lifted in every opportunity he has. So, we may disagree with some things, but on leadership on the issue of Cuba, Dr. Mitchell has been extremely, extremely solid.
All right, we are going to take our final break and come back for our final summation. And I have some final thoughts before we leave. Thank you again, folks. And this is the Bub Report.
Cuba is the only country in the world that has done so much for so many with so little. There's no other country. And I beg my students, I said, when you leave here, do something for Cuba. Even if you have to come back as a tourist, you got everything free. Sometimes Cuba has a hurricane. They need help. Put a barrel somewhere, someplace in a supermarket. Let people put things in it. Help them because they have helped you. A medical degree costs thousands and thousands of US dollars. And if you get it free, you don't think that you owe the country that you get it free something. You must owe them something.
That was Grenada's ambassador to Cuba. That's Her Excellency Clara Charles. But now we're going to wrap up. I'll start with you, Kimberly. 30 seconds, final thoughts.
Okay, the pressure is on. Since I have 30 seconds, I just want to invite everyone to go to cubanoble.org. That's Cuba, Nobel.org, www. To support the call that the Peace Brigade, the Medical Brigade, the Cuban Medical Brigade, be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. I think it's really critical that we honor and respect and value the incredible work that Cubans have done, in spite, as Clara said, in spite of what they have, the little that they have. And this is one of the ways we can do it, and continue to organize where you are based, continue to hold your elected officials to account. I will do that here in Canada with the Caribbean Solidarity Network. Canada has a role to play in also being complacent, but also actively disrupting Cuban sovereignty and independence. So I just want to encourage folks to vote to support the award of the Nobel Peace Prize, and also do what you can where you're based.
Yafa?
Hi, sorry, I was unmuting myself. I just want to end by saying thank you again for having me here. And the connection that I'm bringing from Palestine just brings me to conclude with the words of Nelson Mandela, who once said that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians. And similarly, I want to add that Palestinian self-determination is closely connected with that in the Caribbean, with that in Africa, and their pursuit for genuine independence. We share an experience of struggle against colonialism, against settler colonialism and apartheid in general. We share a common commitment to combat all forms of racism and racial discrimination and oppression and repression. And we look forward, just I'm sure Cuba is, to the Caribbean response to the latest US bigotry against Cuba that's continuing for decades. And as I said before, the whole world, and we in particular, we owe it to Cuba to really, truly now stand in supporting them. Thank you.
Dr. Horton. I don't think Dr. Horton can hear us. Minister David, I would end with you, but before I do, I would actually like to publicly welcome you back, because there are pressing social economic issues that I would want to address with you. And as a matter of fact, I did also invite the leadership of the New National Party to appear on my show. But they indicated, and I'll put you on the spot, they indicated they had to get permission from the party to do so. So can I get a commitment from you today?
Kellan is trying to get me to give a public commitment that he will hold me to in the court of law, that I will come back.
I would hold you in the court of public opinion, certainly, Mr. David. But
you have always been a dear friend, and I've always been accessible to you. I promise you that in due course I will do an interview on all of what you call pressing issues. This is not writing out of my time for my conclusion, I hope.
No, it won't. It won't. I wouldn't cut. I wouldn't censor you. I am not like.
Yes, I agree, Kellan. I agree. We will find some time. I've been quite busy traveling and COVID and all of that, but I'll find the time to given that it seems so important that you want me to make a public commitment. I will.
Speak to your party folks. Let them come back. This is a fair and balanced platform. All the hard questions. Okay, now wrap up, please. Yes.
I want to thank you for providing the forum, for not only for this session generally. I think you're doing a wonderful job with that, and I want to wish you well with your studies. I noticed you're doing some studies. I wish you well with that. I want to thank Yafa for bringing us up on the Palestinian cause, a cause that is near and dear to my heart. I want to thank you for keeping up the struggle. I hope over the next couple of days things don't take a turn for the worse with all the annexation talk. I hope that the progressive people in Israel stand up to it, and progressive and the community throughout the world, because the entire world stands behind Palestine, but the entire world does not stand up when necessary, and that, I think, is a problem. While we agree, we don't necessarily they submit to the pressures coming on them. I want to also pay tribute to our own diaspora out there, Kellan. Many of them suffered during COVID. I want to express my deep condolences to those who have died as a result of COVID. My dear friend Andre in New York, Big Andre, he died yesterday. I want to express to his family deep condolences. He had COVID a couple of months ago, maybe a few weeks ago, and I did speak to him and he was well, and now I understand he died yesterday. I want to pay tribute to him and to all of the other Grenadians who have suffered, their families have suffered through COVID. With respect to Cuba, I want to thank you for raising the issue of Cuba. Cuba is near and dear to all Caribbean people. As my good ambassador, Clarence Charles, said, never has a country with so little done so much for so many. And that's absolutely correct. I saw Cubans coming off the plane in Italy recently. In Italy, Cubans are out there. In Africa, all over the world, Cubans are, be it the anti-apartheid struggle, as Yafa said, the struggle against Ebola, all of these struggles, Cubans have been there. And with respect to Marco Rubio and his friends, well, we have Cubans coming into Grenada. Our government pays the Cuban doctors for a job well done. The Cubans are free to roam everywhere. Some of them get married, stay in Grenada, they go back and forth to Cuba. So the idea that Cubans are coming to Grenada and stuff is absolute nonsense. We have a contract with the Cuban government, but we pay the Cuban doctors when they do arrive here. And I want to say that we will continue to do that. And what Marco Rubio and his group should be doing is finding a way to get the US government and US doctors to come to the Caribbean to help us with respect to improving our healthcare. That is what we want to hear. The OECS has issued a statement. I stand, and we in Grenada stand behind the statement. We want and enjoy excellent relationship to the United States government. We want to continue to do that. Our largest diaspora is in the United States. Kellen, Kimberly, you're part of it. I want to say to you in closing that you must use your influence to advocate on behalf of the Caribbean in Washington, in Ottawa, wherever you are, because just as Marco Rubio is playing to his base in Florida to try to get votes for the election, you must play to your base so that we can get development in the Caribbean. So I want to wish you well, wish the entire diaspora well, and to let them know that we really enjoy them being part, not just of being Grenadians, but being part of the development of this country. Thank you. Do have a wonderful, wonderful day, and I look forward to your show. And Yafa, just to end by saying to you again, really good luck, and we're in solidarity with your struggles, both personally and as a people. Thank you.
Mr. David, I hope you have the same energy and enthusiasm when I come at you with those hard questions. And you're welcome to come back. Thank you so much, Mr. David, and have a wonderful Sunday. To the viewers, thank you so much for, again, joining us on the Bub Report every Sunday at 11. Between 11 and 12. Next week, we will be focusing on policing and criminal justice in Grenada in the wake of the recent incident involving the contractor down there. And the following week, we will be looking at the GCNA issue and mergers. Again, this is the Bub Report Sunday edition. I also want to acknowledge my friends on the ground in Grenada who have been doing a lot of the groundwork in helping me to book a lot of the guests. So I really want to thank and appreciate them. A lot of them don't want me to publicly acknowledge who they are, but certainly I want to thank them for that. All right. Enjoy your Sunday, everyone, and have a great week. Bye-bye.